Mosa Babu Toha, silence of water. Father typing on a keyboard. Mother reading the morning paper aloud to cover the sound of a neighbor's radio, hanging lamp swinging in the breeze from a cracked window. Flies losing balance. Sometimes. Black and white pictures on walls, searching for colors. Kettle on stove. One big drop hammers the roof. No lightning, thunder, or clouds. It rains only on this house. Dust and concrete stuff the nostrils of other houses. Water on stove no longer boils. Shrapnel has cut its throat. Hello, dear guests. Welcome to the next part of the program. Now is AVA HOMA and her novel, Daughters of Smoke and Fire, in conversation with AVA HOMA, Stanislava Bosilcic.
Okay, hope you can hear me now. Good evening. I would like to thank you all for coming today. And we are going to be joined here, as already stated, by AVA HOMA, the author of a very interesting novel called Daughters of Smoke and Fire. As you probably all well know, the topic of this year's Bookstan is called Zarjavele Trobente, or the Rusty Trumpets. And this year's Bookstan mostly focuses on narration, on how can different narration actually become the voice of an entire generation that can travel through space and time, as well as narration that somehow, unfortunately, stays trapped within its own generation. Ava Homa is an awarded writer, journalist, and activist, and her texts were published in some of the most significant world media. Daughters of Smoke and Fire is a recipient of many awards, including a Nautilus Book Award. Ava, can you hear me?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hopefully everybody can hear you. I'm very happy that you can join us today. And I hope that we're going to have a very interesting conversation, as well as introduction of your book that has been translated here in December of last year. It has been published as the translated version. So for those who haven't had the chance to read it yet, the first thing that I would ask you is to maybe tell us more about the book and introduce us to what you meant to say in this book.
Well, hello everyone. I want to start by expressing my gratitude to my lovely translator. Thank you so much to the publishers and to the organizers of this festival. I'm really excited to be facing my Bosnian brothers and sisters and have a conversation with you. So thank you for this opportunity. Daughters of Smoke and Fire is the story of a sibling, Leila and Shia. They're very much affected by their father's past activism. And so Leila, who loves art, the reason she's so interested in films and filmmaking is to take these untold stories of her people onto a global stage. And her brother Chia loves to become a human rights lawyer and take the perpetrators of crime against Kurdish people into the International Criminal Court. Now, they face a lot of obstacles, especially when Chia decides to take part in a protest in Iran. As you know, they have been frequently happening in this country. And he disappears. he disappears and he falls upon Layla to try to figure out where he is, if he's alive, how to help him, and all of that. Yeah.
The novel has a very specific dedication that I would like to share with the audience here. To Kurdish women for flourishing in barren fields, and to Farzad Kamangar for imagining otherwise. Can you share with us why this specific dedication? We can start with the part that is dedicated for Kurdish women, and then we can move on to Farzad Kamangar.
Sure. I mean, we human beings are such host of contradiction and contradictory qualities. On one hand, we're really, really fragile. It doesn't take much to destroy a human being emotionally, destroy their confidence, traumatize them. It also doesn't take much to just take someone's life away from them. You know, we're so dependent on oxygen, on water, and on all those things. So we are really, really fragile on one hand, and on the other hand, we can be extremely resilient. And when it comes to resilience, I tip my hat off and bow to women, minority women around the world. But I know more about Kurdish women, so I dedicated this book to them because these are women who rise against not just one level of oppression, but triple and quadruple oppression. Right, Kurdish women have faced male chauvinism. They have faced racial and ethnic chauvinism of the states ruling over them. They face poverty, extreme economic hardship. They face war and instability. And they're basically living in this country that's been erased off the map. And that has significant consequences in all the environments. So for you to live in these situations and yet still stand up, rise up, and not only help yourself, but help other people in that situation is something that I bow to, is something that I really take inspiration from and respect. So that's why I wanted to dedicate this book to Kurdish women whose narratives are not being heard, and yet still they're out there trying to help everyone else.
We will talk later about Schuyler, who is actually one of those characters, one of those women who managed to fight against many, many things, and yet they have their own tragedies behind them. So they are probably one of the examples of those women that you just talked about, of how a Kurdish woman actually has so many levels of oppression that she has to fight against, and she still manages to do that. And then we go to Farzad Kamangar for imagining otherwise. As I said, Farzad Kamangar was a school teacher whose letters from imprisonment actually inspired you to write this novel. How influential was he on your motivation to actually write this novel?
Right. So I've always been looking for people who are, in a way, able to rise up above the difficulties. Because, like I said, we can be really fragile. It's so easy to fall into, depression and anxiety and disappointment. And yet, every now and there are people who are larger than life. And so I admired people like Nelson Mandela, like Gandhi, but they were always these people, or like Martin Luther King, but they were people from faraway cultures, right? Well known, internationally revered. But I wanted to find someone within my own culture. And Farzad is not internationally known. He wasn't allowed because he was imprisoned in such a young age and wasn't allowed to continue doing what he was doing. But what was important to me was the letters that he sent out from prison, and how, despite being tortured in one of the most obnoxious prisons in Iran, in Evin prison, he was able to hold on to hope, to beauty, to art, to humanity. So when he was sending out these letters from prison, sure, he would talk about how he was being tortured, but he would talk about it in this unbelievably poetic, beautiful language. And one side was torture, and the other side were his hopes, right? He never gave up on the hope. He would be like, so he would be in one of the letters, it talks about being tortured. for having a Kurdish ringtone and being treated like a subhuman. He is beaten so badly that the prison guard is afraid that he might be dead. So this young man whose only crime is teaching his mother tongue is laying on the floor in this dark and dank and nefarious prison, almost dying, to the point that the brutal prison guards are wondering if he's alive. And you know what he thinks in his head? He hears really faint melody from outside of the prison. So somewhere out there, someone is celebrating a wedding or something. And then what he does is, instead of filling himself with hatred and with disappointment and with disgust, that look, I'm giving my life for people's freedom and they don't care, they're out there dancing. That's not what he thinks. He starts picturing himself in his own wedding. He starts picturing himself dancing in someone else's wedding. And he says, and Kurds have a handkerchief that they wave in the air. And he says, I'm going to wave my handkerchief in the air and cheer for all the mothers whose children are in prison and are waiting for their return. I'm going to wave my handkerchief and dance for everyone who is giving their life and trying and fighting for freedom and for humanity. And that was such a shocking moment for me, that there is this moment that you decide how you're trying to respond to the reality. He had no control over the oppressive system, over prison, over how he was being treated, but he had a choice in his head when he could choose between hatred and disappointment and between hope and beauty, and remembering that there are still people out there like him who are fighting. And that was so important to me, to wake up, to realize that maybe I could also do it, because he was almost my age, he was from my culture. And I personally was living in a complicated situation at the time, which if you like, I will explore and explain it to you. But I was at this point in my life when I'm like, should I even write? Who's listening? Who cares about writing? And then seeing that letter make me realize, okay, if he can stick to his principles, to his hope and humanity, to literature and art, in the middle of that extreme situation, then I must also pick up my pen and continue writing. And so it was about the right time, right moment. It was about someone who maybe not internationally recognized, but someone who felt really close to me. And we have never met. He has no idea who I am. But he became inspiration for my male character, Chia. So I first started writing Chia's story. And then I said, you know what? Despite everything that he has been through, he's still a male in a patriarchal culture. So if he had a sister and they were pretty close, what would his sister's life look like? And that's how Layla came to be.
I think that all what you just said is how actually Farzad became a voice of a generation, and then he inspired you, and then you become a voice of a generation, and you will probably inspire so many others, and that's very important. That's how stories travel through space and time. And okay, I would also like to quote, since we are already tackling the issue of women. Right in the very prologue, we can see how women are treated in this world belonging to men. And this is how you describe it. I was headed toward the main road, toward the world of men. The streets belonged to them, judgmental men, hypocritical men. Their honor depended on women men. I think these are very powerful words. And do you think that now, is there any improvement in the position of women in, especially Kurdish women in Iran, since you wrote the book? And now, how can we see their position now?
Right. So I think socially, on a social level, there has been a reckoning and an awakening with the movement of Jinjian Azadi, Woman Life Freedom, in Kurdistan. Well, the movement Jinjian Azadi, Women Life Freedom, started in the Kurdish area a long time ago, but it basically found momentum in Iran 2 years ago when the nationwide protest started and went on for a long time. So if you compare younger generations, so young men in their 20s right now, and compare them to how their father treated women, you will see a significant difference. And it's important to acknowledge that and to see that and to help expand that awareness. Nonetheless, we're still far, far away from having a society that is ready to see women as equals, as humans with all the qualities. I mean, you look at the laws in Iran, they're laws of Middle Ages. Women in Iran are not allowed to make any decisions for themselves. They're not treated like an adult. Like a woman in Iran needs a man's permission to get married, needs a man's permission to get divorced, needs a man's permission to have custody of her own children, needs a man's permission even for leaving the country, traveling abroad. So you will see the contrast. Like, on one hand, here are the laws that constantly dehumanize women, these really backward middle-aged laws. And here's this young generation of Kurdish men, Iranian men that are seeing that this is wrong. This makes no sense, right? And that takes a lot for men in patriarchy to understand that maybe patriarchy is not in our interest either. It takes a high level of awareness. But to go back to that quote that you read, in Daughters of Smoke and Fire, I try to tackle three types of violence. One is the extreme violence that their father Alan goes through, and that's genocide. The second type of violence is the state violence, like imprisonment and so torture, which is what the brother goes through. And then what Layla experiences is not as dramatic it was her father and brother experience, but it's a constant, slow burning violence and aggression that she has to deal with on a daily basis, from the cab driver to the grocery store retail to how she's treated in school. And it was important for me to show all these three and show how it affects different characters.
Yes, that's something that is really well described, I believe, that
Thank you.
constant struggle, and I can even say maybe gradual struggle, that it seems that she starts as a child and that she's surrounded by all those things that she's not even aware of, maybe sometimes that's not how normal children live. And then it becomes even more and more. And even though, as you say, you cannot pinpoint to a specific event that it's making her feel a very horrible way, she still feels that it's just coming and coming to her, and then she really feels overwhelmed at one point.
Yeah, it's relentless. It's nonstop.
As we said, the characters in this novel are fictional, as you said. You can see clearly that Chia is based on Farzad Kamangar, his story. They have so many similarities. To a certain extent, probably that's how maybe I'm wrong, but I see a bit of your thinking maybe in Layla. You have a bit of similar stories as well. So the characters are fictional, but we hear these constant radio stories, TV stories, as leitmotifs of Kurdish tragedies. And they're the leitmotifs maybe in Layla's story, but they're very important. How well are these stories actually heard outside of literature, if they are at all? And does literature actually have the power to convey these strong messages of those who cannot be heard otherwise?
That's such a great question. Thank you for that. So, yeah, so to your point, it was very important for me to have all the historical facts gathered up and rounded up and like have it in front of me, and then look at the life of my fictional character and see how I could insert the external event with the private life, so personal and political, and bring it all together, kind of braid it together in a way that feels organic. And I have to say that took a long time, because it was really, really hard to have that mix and match and then have the story in the foreground and the history in the background in a way that the readers won't feel like they've been lectured, but then they are aware that this is not made up. This is completely based on what life is like for Kurdish people in Iran. And then to your points about, is it being heard? I really like to sit with that question for a while, because one of the consequences of not having a country of your own, of being stateless, is that you're overlooked and denied everywhere, even in the most liberal and democratic environments. So if you look at, for example, academia, that's a environment that doesn't try to be deliberately oppressive. It's not a corporate environment. It's not a, brutal dictatorship environment. And yet still in academia, if you go to like some of the best universities across the world, you will see that there is Middle Eastern studies, Far East studies, Middle East studies, and then within that there is like Persian studies, Turkish studies, Arab studies, and very rarely, only on a handful of universities, there is Kurdish studies. Because you have to be very aware to know, okay, within Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, there are Kurds. And because they're stateless, their situation is so different that they deserve being studied independently. So if Kurds or other minorities aren't heard within academia, they aren't heard even within the art world, right? Like if you go to New York's wonderful Museum of Modern Arts, there is like Persian arts, Turkish arts, Arab art, and you can guarantee that some of those are also Kurds within there, but they're not being marked because they don't have their own country. So if art doesn't make space for minorities, if academia doesn't make space for minority, who does? And with that comes back to your point about the power of literature, right? So it's not just literature has the capacity to make space for what's being unheard, for what's been untold, and what's really deserves being heard. Is that literature doesn't just give you information. So if you look at, for example, liberal media, not mainstream media, but some more open-minded media, usually on the left side, you might hear or read a little bit about this minority group and that minority group, but it doesn't have the power to move you and to help you remember the way a novel does. When you pick up a novel, you live with those characters. And so it's not just numbers for you. It's not like, oh, yeah, courts are being suppressed. You know what it's like to be a woman and to go through the physical and like visceral and psychological pressure of non-existence day in and day out. So when you read a novel and you live with a character for a while, you're not going to forget that. It has the power to move you in a very unique way. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. And I completely agree because you remember the novel more vividly since you lived with that character. And I completely agree with what you said. We also have different generations in this in your novel. And every generation fights its own battles to be accepted and understood by others. How are the battles of Layla's parents different than the battle of Layla herself and her brother Chia?
Thank you for noticing that. That's also one of the things that was very important for me while writing this book. I wanted to create two generations and talk about a generation that basically faces extreme violence firsthand. And that's why you have a short chapter of what Father Alan experiences as a kid. And also what Layla's mother experienced, which would be a lot harder than Layla herself experienced, right? But I really, really wanted to focus on what's less seen, and that's inherited trauma, right? So what happens if you didn't go to residential school, you didn't have a gun held to your face, but your parents did, and you're the child of a generation who experienced extreme violence? And how does that affect you physically? Because it's in your DNA, it's in your tissues, it's in your molecule, and how it affects you being raised by parents who are incapable of expressing their loves. They might still have love in their heart, but they're incapable of expressing it. How does it affect you? And so, like you said, every generation does have its own battle and its own struggle. And the way they can fight is different, right? Like with the changes in technology, for example, is one of the reasons how one generation would be different. With the change of people's mindset, I mean, with Layla's father's generation and my own father's generation, it wasn't common to talk about trauma or emotions, whereas I look at kindergarten children now, and they learn a language to speak about their inner world. Like just the fact that we have a generation that is aware of their inner world, and life is not just about going about your life, making money, and all of that is a major shift. But I think it's important, while noticing the difference, it's very important to know that we're not alone. We're not in a vacuum. We are a product of years and years of how our ancestors have gone through life, and the way I live today and you live today is going to affect generations to come. So going back to that moment that Farzad had, that instead of hatred, he chose hope. If you and I keep doing that, we are going to affect the next generation of children that are coming on those small, small, but important moments.
Absolutely. We can also maybe compare the relationship between Shiler and Joanna and the relationship between Hannah and Layla, mothers and daughters both, and how maybe Layla's mother actually, her tragedies actually prevent her from having a normal mother-daughter relationship with her. On the other hand, we have Joanna and Shiler, who are very different in terms that they are closer despite their own tragedies. How can we compare these two relationships? Can we do that?
That's another wonderful question. And I wanted to offer balance in terms of representation, because minorities either aren't written about, or if we're written about, we're written either in a completely demonized way, that these people are horrible, they deserve what they're going through, or it's very sensational or romanticized that, oh, things are so beautiful, these people are perfect. But the reality is something in between. The reality is that we respond to oppression in different ways. And I wanted to have both Hannah and Joanna as two different types of mother that really represent Kurdish society. On one hand, mothers in Kurdish society are really held up high as this extremely strong, resilient women who protect their children no matter what and are able to overcome tragedies. And that is the truth, but is part of the truth. On the other hand, there are mothers so pressured and so broken that they cannot experience motherhood in the sense that society describes, like in the sense that, like, to me, being a parent is not just about physically being able to give birth to children. It's really about this very unique power and ability to step outside of your own concerns and take care of someone else, right? That's what's unique about parenthood. And not everyone who has children is capable of making that transition. Sometimes parents are so pulled into the vortex of their own pain. They're so like submerged that they can't offer this kind of care to the following generation. And that's the difference between Hannah and Joanna. They're both women of the same generation. They've both been through a lot. In fact, Joanna has even been through far more than Hannah has been. But Joanna has this power of alchemy, this alchemy that Farzad Kamayar had, this alchemy that some of us have. Well, I would argue that this is the alchemy that is in all humans, but maybe we don't always tap into it. And that's the moments when we say, okay, I don't have control over external realities, but let me pause before I react on a default automatic way. Let me pause for a second and see what my options are, you know? And that's really the moments when Joanna had and Hannah did not have, and that really affected their daughters, Layla and Schler. As you can see, Layla is a lot more vulnerable. Schler is a lot more empowered because of being nurtured. One of them is being nurtured, and the other one hasn't been nurtured at all.
That's really important because passionate readers, especially, they always tend to be influenced by what they read. So if they read something that is actually presented so perfectly, they might have really wrong expectations, and that's why it's really important to understand that no relationship is perfect and that every relationship is different. So I think that that's a really wonderful way of you to present different types of mother-daughter relationship. Since we mentioned Alan Salmon, I think we can maybe talk about him a bit more, since he's maybe even more than Hannah prevented from having a normal life after experiencing the tragedies that he did. He is constantly, not only that they are preventing him, he's constantly reliving those tragedies in his head. So how often do these tragedies paralyze people from continuing any kind of normal life?
You know, I think in most cases we are affected to the point of not being able to help ourselves and help others. That's why I wanted to have a couple characters who are able to do that, and that's why you know, Farzad moved me to that point. Alan has complete PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that, like you said, stops him from being able um, to offer love. It's really challenging for anyone suffering or struggling with um, mental health to be able um, to offer help. But really, one thing I have learned in my life is when life is really, really, really hard, when I feel like I'm at a dead end and there's nothing I can do for myself, I like to get up and do something for someone else. It could be really, really small. Like it could be just, I like to grow my own food. So I have like some lettuce and tomato in my backyard. It could be that I just pick some of them and give it to my neighbor. It could be that I just bake for my friend. But I have realized that every time life is really hard, if I do something for someone else, that's the best help I've given for myself. So it looks like it's helping someone else, but it's really the best thing for yourself. And that's the thing with Hannah and Alan. They forget that this option exists, this option of helping someone else. And that's ironical because if you think about it, Alan was tortured because he was an activist, right? So he was out there helping people, and yet he was in prison for it. And so, in what way, this is the question, in what way can we help each other and ourselves without harming ourselves and other, right? So that's such a delicate balance that Alan, like many people, couldn't find in his own life.
Yes. I will also, since you mentioned the characters that you described are very different, and they present very interesting people who have very different lives, and they influence each other on in very interesting ways. And that's why I would also like to mention Caro, because he's a character that, from my point of view, he shows some character development. He's a person who also has Kurdish origin, but he's not aware of it that much. He's even ashamed of it at some point. But he gradually becomes a person who accepts that and who is helping others, in this case, Layla, and supports her. Is it hard sometimes to accept? I believe that it was hard for him, but is it hard for him to, for people generally, to accept yourself if you're not well accepted by others? Because he was really, he's a really interesting character in terms of his parents and that relationship, and he was not very well accepted himself, but yet there is some development.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I love how carefully you've studied these characters. I mean, you translated it so you know it in and out. Yes, it was important for me to show that movement because even though Leila and Chia grew up with enough awareness about their heritage, I myself actually grew up really assimilated. I didn't grow up aware of my roots and my history, and even couldn't even really write in my mother tongue for a while. And I taught myself later when I went to Canada. So I had to have characters who were colonized and assimilated because the policy is either assimilate or annihilate. And I couldn't have, on one hand, I wanted to have characters who were not colonized and they were aware. On the other hand, I couldn't make all the characters aware of an identity. And that really has to do with racism. Like when you grow up in a racist society, and society doesn't value your background, you, especially when you're an adolescent, when you're a teenager, and you have this strong desire to belong, to fit in, you're willing to say, oh, but I'm not that. I'm not that inferior, either religious group or ethnic group or whatever, like whatever group that society says they're not good enough. And so this movement towards please accept me, I'm not one of them, is something that Caro experienced and a lot of people around the world experience with where there is racism. And yet it can only take you so far. You know, there is a moment, finally, if you're lucky enough, if you're awake enough, there comes a moment like it came in Caro's life when he thought, I can't keep up this lie for the rest of my life, you know? And so there is this social level of how do I face racism in a mindful way that, again, doesn't harm me or doesn't harm others? And then there's this personal psychological way, which is how do I love myself if my parents never loved me? You know, Layla talks about it. She says it's very hard to love yourself when you have never been loved, that the dark forces find this crack inside you and come inside when you haven't been loved. And that's one thing that connects Caro and Layla. That's this not having been loved and yet able to give each other finally the love that they deserve. So it's both personal and political, that accepting yourself, because the world is never going to accept you first. You have to accept yourself first and then tell the world, you need to accept me the way I am. It never happens that the world says, oh, it's okay, whoever you are, we accept you. That's not the case. The world always finds something. You're either not pretty enough, not tall enough, not light enough, not smart enough. You're just never enough. That's the message. You're not enough. You're not enough. So you have to realize that I am enough and tell the world, stop and accept me the way I am.
Yes. And even if the world doesn't always do that, you still have to find a way to be yourself, to love yourself.
Yeah.
Because that's you
Yeah.
have your own
Yeah.
life, not the life of everybody else. And I think that
Exactly.
the characters of this novel are so very well described because they're human and you cannot judge them, even though that there are so many things that really shock you in certain moments. As you said, for example, Caro, who maybe in his teenage years just didn't want to belong to somebody to a group that was not accepted by others. But you cannot judge him. You cannot judge any of these characters. You can actually understand what they're going through, and that is really, really important. Since we talked about already about Chia as a symbol of endurance, I would just like to read this specific, this is what you talked about, of how he finds light even in the darkest of times, which is something you probably drew from Farzad's letters. I have seen a child's birth. Cries and struggles are the first signs of life, not of weakness. A mountain begins with its first rocks and the human with the first pain. I think that's really something beautiful. It's actually how he knows maybe deep down that his life is ending, but yet he's talking about the very beginning of life and how those struggles are actually signs of life. That's what he sees. Do you maybe have something to add in this respect? What can you comment on this quotation?
So that's something that he's quoting from a legendary poet called Ahmad Shamlu, and he says that the cries are not a sign of weakness. A mountain begins with the first rock, and a human with the first pain. So psychologically, we have this error in our system where, as humans, we feel like unpleasant is bad, which is why we blame ourselves when we catch a cold. You know, we're like, what they do wrong. When life gets difficult, when we lose a job, when we, have challenges, we immediately equate difficulty with bad. You know, if you are born, in a group of people who are struggling, you must be bad. But if you have privileges, if you have wealth, if you have this, you must be good. Whereas these are such different concepts. Pleasant and difficult are very different from right and wrong. You could live a very ethical life and very challenging life, or you could live an extremely unethical, really bad in that sense, unethical life, and yet have all the pleasures of the world, have a yacht, have a jet, have this, have that. So this is a moment for Chia that he distinguishes between bad and difficult. He realizes how much pain he is in being in a prison and not having much hope. And also, he feels a little bit guilty about putting his sister through all of this, right? Because what happens to him directly affects his sister. And yet, he tells other prisoners, by the way, there are 4 other prisoners with Chia, and they were also based on real people. Their stories, even the name of their children, are accurate based on what actually happened. So he does have this moment when he realizes vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is courage. It takes courage to talk about our difficulties, and it takes courage to understand that having difficulties doesn't mean being bad or being wrong necessarily, not all the time.
We are almost coming to an end, but I would really like to discuss this one important subject. That's something that you, as an activist, really talk about, and that is the prevention of suicide, especially female suicide. And that there is something that I did not know about until I read this book. That's the percentage of women who actually die of suicide by self-immolation.
Yeah.
Layla is a character who is often trapped in her body and by her thoughts. And all those tragedies cannot make her life any easier. And how can women feel less pressure in the society? How can we prevent women from these drastic measures of ending their lives, especially in such a tragic way?
Right. So at the time when I was writing the book, I have been working on suicide prevention for at least 17 years. And the type of the method that people actually use to end their lives has changed. Nowadays, it's more taking pills. But there was a point in time, especially when I was researching the book, when fire was the main tool for. And you have to realize that fire is rationally, if you actually are in so much pain that you want to, because when people talk about suicide, it's not that they want to die. It's just that the pain is extreme and they want an end to that pain, right? But if you choose fire, can you imagine the irony of that? Because fire is, first of all, it may not actually kill you. It may just burn you. It may just disable you. Secondly, it's extremely painful, like compared to just taking pills. But who would choose that? Like, even if your life is so hard that you're choosing to end it because you don't find a way out, why would you choose fire? Unless the pain inside is so huge, so out of control, that you're trying to put it on display by choosing fire. You're saying, this is how I feel. What you look at me when you see me on fire, this is how I feel inside, right? So that tells you about the extreme of pain, the extreme of pressure that, a Kurdish woman in Iran goes through. And that goes back to your previous question when you said, what's the percentage of people who give up on their pain? Unfortunately, majority of us give up, right? But what is important is to know that while there is this large group of people who find no way out of pain other than death, there are also these unknown group of Kurdish women who are risking their own lives to help these women in danger. Why are they risking their lives? Because in Iran, any kind of activism is treated as a crime. So if you don't deal with the government, you're not trying to topple the government, you're just trying to help people at risk, the government sees you as a threat because Iranian government wants all the Kurds to just die. That's like what they want. So we can steal your water, so we can steal your land, we can steal your resources. You guys just die. So if you go and help these people at risk, government starts putting pressure on you, right? So, but it was important for me to show that to my readers, that while there is extreme pain, there's also extreme courage. You know, it takes extreme courage to risk your life to help someone else's life. And in terms of your question of what can be done in a situation like that, so the ideal answer would be to make structural changes. Because if this woman had help, had power, like usually women who choose fire are women who even don't have education, can't get a job, don't have any way of empowering themselves. So if structurally we have a system that allows these women to take control of their life, then that's a good way to prevent it. If they're not under poverty, if there's education, if there's jobs, it's very different. And then the other question would be, so really, now that we are living under this oppressive and brutal Iranian government, what can be done, right? And the answer is, well, what if society was more sympathetic to people who are thinking about killing themselves? So instead of telling them, how dare you think about killing yourself? You're being so selfish, or it's a sin, you're going to go to hell. Instead, they were told, oh my God, it must be really, really hard, your life. Tell me about it. Just that moment. You must be in a very difficult situation. Why don't you tell me about it? And just listen instead of commenting, just listen. So it looks small, but it's really important because research has shown that a person who thinks about ending their life, if they're listened to for 7 minutes, just 7 minutes, that can change the course of their life. So that's going back to one of the motives in this book, and there's little moments, small moments, quiet moments that can change things.
Yes, I agree that we should always try to listen, and awareness is something, it's a good start, definitely a good start. And thank you for that, because you definitely have raised awareness. I would
Thank you.
like to leave some space to questions from the audience, if there are um, any comments or questions.
Can you hear me? Thank you.
Yes.
First, I just say thank you for that important and very amazing book. My question is, if you had the opportunity to meet Layla, what would you say to her?
Thank you for that question.
Welcome.
Can I ask what you would tell her? Because I feel like you have something that you think would have helped her. Can you share that with me?
Yes, I have to say I understand her,
Hmm.
really understand.
Wow. Well, that's what we just talked about, to tell someone that I feel you, you know, and to give Leila that moment that she feels being heard, that you give her the opportunity that she feels seen. That's really the best gift we can give each other as humans, and it's precious and it's priceless. So thank you for that thought. Thank you. I'll tell Layla you said you understand her. I'm sure she'll be happy.
Are there any more questions? Okay. Thank you. I would, since we don't have more time, I would just like to read something you wrote in the author's note, and maybe in that way we can wrap up this very interesting conversation. Literature cultivates our senses by humanizing the anti-people, by encouraging us to recognize our unconscious, conscious, human-lens binaries. Literature fuels us to bring awareness to and change our conditioning formed over thousands of years, according to which a person who looked different was equated with danger. I think that this is something that really fits into this year's book stand and the topic of how generations can influence other generations, how voices can be heard through generations. And in that sense, I believe that your book has done magnificently. That Daughters of Smoke and Fire have actually really managed to leave a very important impact and be a very important voice for other generations. So I would like to thank you for that. And And thank you for this conversation that was really inspiring for me, and I believe for everyone who was present today.
I'm so grateful to you. Thank you for those wonderful questions. And I don't see the audience, but I want to say that I appreciate that you spend your afternoon with us. Thank you so much for your interest in books and also for your interest in traveling through books. I hope this book takes you to a place that maybe it's not possible to travel to safely, but also gives you a glimpse into the depth of reality in there. This was an amazing opportunity. I'm so excited to be virtually in Bosnia, and I hope to be able to come back in person one day. Thank you
We
so
will
much.
welcome you very, very happily. Thank you.